following takes place between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m.
It's Political Vindication Radio.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Who sees firsthand the concrete and mortar, the guard posts and machine gun towers, the dog runs and the barbed wire, can ever again take for granted his or her freedom or the precious gift that is America.
All this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, a lot of horse stuff. Americans love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Welcome to Political Vindication Radio, where liberals come to get perfected. This is politicalvindication.com on the air, and my name is Frank, also known as Uncle Seth the Noble.
And my name is Shane, also known as Ever Vigilant.
Tonight, Coyne Maloney, the creator and director of Indoctrination U, joins us to talk about his film and why leftist hostility toward free thought on college campi should be a concern for all Americans.
We're working on a documentary film.
Call the campus police. You need to leave or you're going to go to jail.
Well, how can I get an appointment if no one will return my request?
You're welcome to call me.
Instead of calling you, can I just talk with you now?
No, I'm busy.
If a professor is comparing one of the students who took his class to Hitler and to suicide bombers, a student, by the way, from the Middle East, then I think that's a story.
They're afraid to give their viewpoint in class because they know it won't be tolerated.
If you're open-minded, you have to be this. If you're a good-hearted person, you have to be this.
They really believe that this is the only view any reasonable person could possibly hold.
I've been learning in geography class that gender is socially constructed.
I never knew that carbon chains had anything to do with politics, but they do. I don't know.
Why won't you say what's wrong? Why won't anyone believe your story? Why won't you say what's wrong? Why won't anyone believe your story? Why won't you wait? Don't wanna wait. Why won't you go ahead and speak? Why won't you wait? Don't wanna wait. Why won't you let go ready?
I'm politically liberal. Your average sort of mainstream Democrat doesn't necessarily believe this is really happening. I didn't really understand it was really happening.
Why won't you wait? Don't wanna wait. Why won't you let go ready?
The big buzzword on college campuses is diversity, diversity, diversity. We talk about diversity of skin color. We talk about having different ethnicities come to camp. The university is totally ignoring diversity of thought.
Hey, thanks for listening to Political Vindication Radio. We're here every Tuesday night. We're here for 2 hours. My name's Shane. I'm here with Frank.
Lakers fighting back early.
Well, we need them to fight. We need them to fight for the next 3 games, actually.
Yes, we do.
Hey, what a great time we're going to have tonight. We're talking with Coyne Maloney. He's the creator of Indoctrinate U. He's a conservative warrior. He's here to talk to us. Evan, how are you?
Hi, thanks a lot for having me on.
Excellent. We're so glad that you take the time to come on and talk to us a little bit about this. This is a whole lot of fun.
Oh, sure thing. I appreciate it.
Hey, before we get started, I want to know a little bit about you. I want to know about your background a little bit and what inspired you to do what you did.
Sure. Well, let's see. By trade, I'm actually a software developer. I got into film quite by accident, and when I started doing some short videos for my website, brainterminal.com, and as a result of that, was able to build up enough of an audience where one investor asked me if I ever had an idea for a feature-length film. And I'd always wondered why it was that with all the vast media resources in this country, it seemed that there were virtually no outlets, no documentary filmmakers willing to take on what's happening on college campuses. You know, you were talking before the break about oil companies. Well, you know, one of the most expensive things in our culture is 4 years of education, and it's also one of the fastest rising expenses that anyone could possibly buy. You know, education costs a lot of money. It's a service that is just increasing in cost, and it's taxpayer financed, not only at public universities, but at private colleges. They're for one, universities, public or private, get tax breaks. They don't have to pay a corporate tax, but in a lot of cases, they're acting as political instruments. So this was a story that I just didn't see anybody covering. And when I was fortunate enough to build up an audience online and get the opportunity to do a film, it was just something that seemed natural to me.
Evan, this is Frank. I want to thank you for coming on to Political Vindication Radio.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Great. You know, and that's what I want to get into. I want to get into your documentary here, Indoctrinate U. You know, what was this, you know, specific inspiration around this? I mean, was it something that happened in your college days, or is it something that's grown on to you as you've grown older, just a concern that just popped up? What inspired this documentary?
Well, you know, to a certain degree, my undergraduate experience at Bucknell University had something to do with it. I mean, it was the first introduction I had to really the whole concept of groupthink. When I got to college, it was pretty clear right from the orientation program on that they expected you to think in certain ways, and that there were certain points of view that were just regarded as the correct points of view and the point of view that kind, caring people had. And then there were all the other points of view. Basically anything that disagreed, well, those people are evil. You know, we don't associate with folks like that. And I just thought that environment was odd, because from the first week on, tolerance and diversity were the two primary goals of the university drilled into our head. You know, we were told to value and tolerate everybody, and yet they would not value and tolerate anybody who shared an opinion that differed from theirs. So it just struck me as being completely hypocritical how a university that claims to pride tolerance and diversity would end up doing exactly the opposite. And it was something that I noticed when I was a publisher of a newspaper in college, and on a number of occasions the entire press run would be stolen. We'd have stacks around campus, and stacks of it would be picked up, and you'd walk by a dumpster and you'd see, you know, 50 copies unmolested sitting on a pile of garbage. And I just thought, you know, that it was pretty obvious that when they were talking about tolerance and diversity that they were lying. And, you know, at the time I didn't really understand that this was happening at other schools. I went to college in the early 90s, and there wasn't really talk radio to the extent that there is now. The internet wasn't a medium for blogs and so forth. So there was just nobody covering this stuff. And so I didn't realize at the time, until a couple of incidents made the national news, that this was a problem happening on campuses all over, and it wasn't just limited to where I was.
Well, so you have to be pretty confrontational to kind of, to make the movie that you did. You walk right in, and you are facing these guys, and my next question has to do with, are they open about it? Or is there a sense that this is a scam, they're pulling the rug over on us?
Well, I think they're a bit outdated in how they perceive the current media landscape. You know, to a wide degree around the country, it seems as though campuses exist as communities unto themselves that tend to be really quite different from the towns and cities that surround them. And so there's a very different environment the minute you set foot on campus. And part of that, again, is groupthink, and it's just the fact that everybody thinks in one way, and so they're not exposed to viewpoints that counter their thinking. And what ends up happening is that I think they forget that other people have different points of view. And so the kinds of things that happen on campus, suppressing speech of someone you don't like, seems very natural if you think the person whose speech you're suppressing is evil. Well, if they think that anyone who has a slightly right-of-center viewpoint is evil, then there are a lot of good Americans who they're going to try to shut down with speech codes and tools like that. So, it seems to me that they forget that when these stories get off campus, they're perceived in a wider culture that is quite different from the culture that exists on campus. And so I think that they're taken aback by that, and I think that they haven't really realized that this is not the media environment of the mid-'80s where they could get away with this stuff and nobody would call them on it. So, when someone like me shows up on campus and starts asking questions about some of the things that have happened, they have no idea how to handle that. And they certainly don't feel as though they're accountable to anybody. They don't feel accountable to the people paying the bills. They certainly don't feel accountable to taxpayers who are either underwriting the institution to a large degree or underwriting it through tax breaks. So, I think this is something that people have a right to ask. People have a right to ask why these institutions are trampling on people's free speech and free thought rights, and why, when I show up and I ask those questions, the response was almost uniformly to call the police. So that's something that we saw a number of times in our film, is that whenever I asked an uncomfortable question, it was usually a signal to call the police.
Well, but the only time they want the police there is when you're asking them questions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. What about the alumni, Evan?
Well, I think alumni tend to be pretty unaware of how campuses have devolved over the last couple generations. I think, listen, I had fun in college. I really did enjoy my 4 years at Bucknell. And even though I criticized the environment, I think in the long run, it wasn't that bad. There are worse positions to be in than to be surrounded by a bunch of people who disagree with you, because in a way, I probably benefited more than some of the left of center students. If you're a liberal student coming in from high school, you can get through 4 years of college without ever having a single theory of yours challenged. And if your thinking is never challenged, you're not really going to be able to articulate very well what you think and why you think it. So, I actually look at the larger culture and how we talk about politics these days, and I wonder whether the environment on campus has led to that, because it seems as though it's very difficult to argue with someone about, say, affirmative action without immediately being called a racist and a bigot if you don't support the left-of-center point of view. And I think that's a result of people not learning how to argue in college.
Evan, when I went to college down in San Diego, down at Cal State San Marcos, I have very similar experiences, and that was considered actually a conservative campus. I don't understand how it got that reputation, because, but this is what I found down when I went to college, and that is there was a big disconnect or disparity of ideology between the student body and the faculty. The student body tended to be, though you had a lot of wild-eyed young liberals, you also had a lot of conservatives who just were very quiet in class, scared to speak up. Now, I know myself, I was punished countless times for my political point of view. Do you think this is a matter of the faculty bullying most of the students in college?
Well, I think it's not just the faculty, but it's also administrators. I have noticed also what you noticed, and that is that there is this disconnect, and that a lot of cases the ideology of the faculty and administrators are not shared by the student body, and that's usually when you see the most conflict. And that's when you hear of these cases. A lot of times they'll pop up in the national media because it's a situation now where that conflict will lead to students, being punished simply for sharing their views, as you said. I think that one of the reasons why we have to look at the administration in particular is because they're the ones who enforce the rules. While it is true that you can very easily get graded down if you don't share your professor's point of view on a certain topic, Some professors are very good, and I had a professor of economics at Bucknell who was a self-avowed Marxist, who was actually one of the best professors I ever had, a real decent guy, intellectually honest. He knew I disagreed with him, and he would let me argue with him, and it didn't affect my grade. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. But administrators are in the position of enforcing these things called speech codes, which a lot of times are hidden as harassment policies and that sort of thing. But the way harassment is defined, the clip that you played earlier kind of touched on this. The way harassment is defined is very important. If you're going to entrust a whole group of administrators with the task of deciding what is and is not offensive, well, guess what? They're going to tend to find things offensive if they don't agree with it. And if all the administrators at a given school tend to think one way or another, then the people who disagree with those administrators, they're going to be the ones who get punished. They're going to be the ones whose academic careers are ruined simply for having the wrong point of view. And that's the kind of thing that we've covered a number of times in Indoctrinate U.
So do you think that the faculty that we see on college campuses today, do you think that is sort of the older generation of the 60s generation that began sort of this upheaval in the universities? Is this what we're dealing with here? The baby boom generation, that ideology, that me first generation is now teaching our youth today?
Well, I think that's part of it. I don't have hard data on the numbers of people who went into academia from the protest movement in the 60s. But it is a pretty well-known fact that a lot of people did go into PhD programs and things like that in order to avoid the draft. And if you opposed Vietnam, I don't begrudge you that. But the problem is that when you get such a massive influx of people who have the same point of view, they coalesce around that point of view. And it becomes so central to their identity that anybody who comes in and thinks differently, they threaten the very existence of that identity. So I think what ends up happening, or what happened in the past in academia, is you had a massive influx of people in the late 60s, early 70s going into academia who were going in partially for ideological reasons. And when they got into academic programs, by the late 70s, some of them were professors. And by the mid-'80s, a lot of them were tenured professors. And what ends up happening then is when that ideology gets from the point of being dominant just in an undergraduate program, and then they end up eventually a decade and a half later being tenured professors, well, by the time tenure happens, that's set in stone, basically. These people can't be fired if they have tenure. And so they're going to be able to use all the power that they have as tenured professors to do whatever they want. And I know that we've had a number of instances where professors have had their political point of view held against them. In one case that we cite in the film, simply a professor who's a registered Republican. The fact that she was a registered Republican was discovered by her colleagues. She was very well respected. She was widely published. She was the chair of the department. But within several weeks of her colleagues finding out that she was a registered Republican, they turned on her. They removed her as department head. She had colleagues come up to her and ask her, is this a mixed marriage? Because they initially found out that her husband was a Republican, and that's what made them suspicious about her. And she was told that if we had known you were a Republican when we hired you, we wouldn't have hired you. And so that's the kind of thing that happens when groupthink takes over an institution.
Well, Joe, and so that's why you have to celebrate David Horowitz coming in and upsetting that, or at least uncovering that kind of blatant discrimination.
Well, he was one of the first people out there to really look at this issue. And he brought attention to it that I don't think would have come any other way.
Well, yeah, and he took a beating for that. Not that he can't take that, but you hear a lot of outrage, and then they have the gall to talk about the freedom for them to say what they want to say, as if we're infringing upon their First Amendment rights to say what they want to say.
I actually had an opportunity to videotape a speech that David Horowitz made up at Brown. It was actually the first piece of footage that I shot for the film. Unfortunately, it didn't end up in the film, but what was interesting about it was a lot of people had assumed that there would be a disruption. Last time he came to Brown, there was a disruption. It ended up shutting down his speech. But when he was there, some students started calling him a fascist and told him that he shouldn't have the right to speak there. And I thought, is the irony of that statement, calling someone a fascist and telling them they have no right to speak, is the irony of that statement completely lost on the speaker? And I guess it is, because, I thought I had fallen through the rabbit hole and I was in Wonderland, but that's what happens when you set foot on a college campus.
Evan, I had the pleasure to read David Horowitz's autobiography, Destructive Generation, and it really was a remarkable insight into, obviously, the 1960s when he was in college, because he talked about how dominant the communism, Marxism was. Now, from my understanding, when I see a lot of your videos and other videos that I see, when we see protests and marches at universities, Marxism seems to be plastered everywhere. Signs of, Marxist organizations. We even hear them, supporting the illegal alien movement. How entrenched is the Marxist ideology in the universities right now?
Boy, that's very hard to say. There's certainly a lot more sympathy for it on a lot of campuses than there is in the rest of the country. There's probably more sympathy for Marxism on a college campus than there is in a place like Poland, that actually saw what happened when that ideology was implemented. It makes me question the long-term relevance of institutions that cling to an ideology that not only has never succeeded, but has failed to the cost of many millions of bodies. I don't really understand that, but it's an interesting question. There's certainly a lot of sympathy for what I would have hoped by now would be a dead ideology. But that's the beauty of academic life. You can immerse yourself entirely in the realm of theory and never have to set foot in the real world.
Yeah, well, there you go. And so let's talk real quickly as we move on to issues on campus. The Israel-Palestine issue, multiculturalism pushed by professors, socialism versus capitalism, what Frank had just talked about, and America in general. America as the bully, America as the terrorist, America as the cause of a lot of the problems around the world. I know when I went to college, you're dealing with a lot of kids that are 19, 20, 22, 23 years old. They have no history. They have no idea what the country is about. So a lot of these professors believe these issues that they're pushing are actually opening these students to views that they haven't heard before. That mainstream society they're the equalizer for mainstream society.
That's very true. I've had professors tell me that in Q&A sessions after the film. They've said things like, I actually heard the quote, our job as professors is to deprogram students from all the hours of Fox News that they watch.
Yeah.
And, I thought, well, first of all, so what are you saying, that the purpose of college is to become an alternate television network to Fox News? Don't we already have MSNBC and CNN and everything else? I thought that's an odd way to characterize the function of a university. I thought the purpose of a university was to expose people to ideas and to help people find truth through their own critical processes. But, I guess that's not the case anymore, at least not the case in the minds of some professors, if that's what they're actually saying. And I know that they're saying it to me, and I'm sure that that's just a small sample of the population of professors that thinks that way.
Well, they really think they're doing us all a favor by that. But much of the time when I talk to professors and would challenge them, they are working from an outline. They've given this lecture 1,000 times, and they're going through, and a lot of them don't want to be stopped. They don't want to be questioned. They don't want people to raise their hand and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. What about this or what about that? A lot of the time, they'll just say something snippy, make an ass out of you, and hope that that'll teach you to keep your mouth shut, let them get through the lecture on that sense.
Yeah, there are some professors like that too, I would guess. You know, there are so many different styles of teaching that professors have that I would like to think that they're not all like that, but I know I had a couple like that myself.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite teachers was an English teacher who was an atheist and spent a whole lot of time telling us that where we actually wanted to go was hell because that's where all our friends were going to be. You know, and he was so popular, Evan, that people would sit out in the hallway on the floor just to listen.
Mm-hmm.
He was that charismatic, and it was, you know, I look back on that now because I was taken with him as well, and I recognize the power that he has. And the people that gravitate toward education are, in many ways, see themselves sometimes as revolutionaries, and they have a great talent, they have a great ability to sway and to make people think. And if it was the case that they were opening minds and debating all kinds of different ideas like some of my philosophy professors would do, it was just a joy to go to class because you never knew what side he was going to take on that. They have a lot of power, these professors. They hold a lot of power.
Do you think that you were swayed by him for very long?
No, and in fact, that kind of leads to my next question was, eventually, where I recognized that I was conservative was because it didn't feel right.
Right.
When he would tell me things, and it's made me think a lot about how we know we're conservative or liberal. Is it, I want to trivialize it as like a genetic thing, or is it something that is a kind of a personality print? But I felt uncomfortable with what he was telling me, and I said it just didn't seem right. It didn't follow in that sense. So I don't know if he made me a conservative or I became more conservative because of him. But my next question to you really is what effect does it actually have on students? Are they churning out thoughtless liberals on the colleges?
Well, that's where it becomes very interesting because, you know, just as you responded in a particular way to your professor, we've all had these examples going through college where maybe all your friends liked a certain professor and you didn't for whatever reason, or vice versa. Different personality types are going to react differently to the same stimulus. So you could get a professor in front of a group of 40 students, and it could be a left-wing professor, it could be a right-wing professor, and they could both be trying to get you to think what they think. And only a certain percentage of people are going to respond. The question that's important, and this is what you're asking, and this is something that I think would be very difficult to measure, does that affect people's ideology down the road? In your case, it didn't, but, you know, you're probably not representative of the larger population. Most people don't have, talk radio shows online, and most people aren't that much of political junkies. So you might have come to your understanding in a way that other people might not. I do know this, though, that at least to a certain degree, even though I think that a certain percentage of people are going to be pushed toward the ideology of the professor, I think a lot of the ways that campuses operate these days and a lot of the ways that certain professors try to push their ideology onto others is actually causing a reaction in the opposite direction and is probably pushing people further in the opposite direction than they would if they weren't using such heavy-handed tactics or if they weren't so dictatorial about trying to get you to think what they think. I know in the case of Bucknell, where I went to college, a number of people about 5, 10, 15 years after I got out have become very politically active in conservative circles. And I wonder whether or not that's a reaction to the environment at Bucknell. I can't imagine it's a coincidence. So, perhaps in a way it benefits conservative thinkers because it creates people who are more interested in fighting for that cause. The question is, does that number offset the number of people who are swayed? And that I couldn't tell you. But I also think that life has a way of bringing reality back to you, and the more years that you spend out of college, the further away you get from the theory that people try to imprint on you in college, and the more you realize that a lot of the theory that sounds great in college doesn't actually work when exposed to real-world conditions.
Hey, Evan, when did you know you were a conservative?
That's interesting, because when you were telling me about your experience earlier, it pretty much reminded me of mine in a way, and I have a very similar theory to yours. I think that, there are so many facts in the world out there that if you wanted to adhere to any ideology, you could find the facts to support your line of thinking. I think that people are innately in tune towards certain ways of thinking over time, and it certainly gets affected by their situation in life. But I think that people, just like people tend to have an emotional makeup that's particular to them, just like people have different personalities, I don't know if it's a personality type that's drawn to particular ideologies, but I do think that people have a natural gravitation, like you did, to things that feel right to you. And that's what happened to me, and it happened to me when I was in junior high school. I went to public school here in New York City, and, much in the same way that college campuses tended to be pretty left of center, I didn't exactly have a lot of conservative teachers in elementary school and junior high. And you wouldn't think that would actually be noticed by someone, but I did kind of notice it just in the general environment. I didn't know enough about it to react to it, but I also just thought it was normal, because at the time when I was a kid, I actually thought of myself as pretty liberal. And, I was a bit of an odd kid, I guess, because in second grade I was asking kids in the schoolyard whether their parents were going to be voting for Reagan or Carter. And when I was in junior high, I campaigned for Walter Mondale by handing out flyers up and down the New York City Marathon route. But at one point, we had to give a speech in class, in a social studies class. And my speech was about politics, about nuclear proliferation in particular. That's what I got assigned. So I got up in front of class, and I gave the talk that I knew I was supposed to give, because this is how everybody thought. It was the election of '84 around that time, and everybody thought that Reagan was, a madman, and he couldn't be trusted with the nukes, because we get into a nuclear war with the Soviets with him in charge again. And so that's basically the talk that I gave when I was standing up in front of my class. But I realized halfway through my talk, that I didn't believe a word I was saying. And I didn't really understand exactly why I didn't believe it, but I just intuitively felt that I was happy that the United States had nuclear defenses, because I didn't trust the Soviets. And I didn't know why at the time I didn't trust the Soviets, but I just didn't. And as I learned more about history, I certainly understood then, but I just had this natural inclination of feeling, wait a minute, this isn't right for me, this isn't right for who I am. I don't actually believe what I'm saying. So I remember that day as being a day where I stood up a liberal and sat down as a non-liberal.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it is. Evan, I had a history professor that would have told you the reason why you're you're anti-Soviet and pro-American is because you've been indoctrinated by our culture to believe the goodness of America.
I certainly not in liberal Manhattan, New York City, USA. I certainly wasn't getting too indoctrinated into conservative thinking here when I was a kid. I just assumed that I shared the politics of my parents' generation. I was pretty much the only Maloney that I knew when I finally realized that I wasn't a liberal. I was the only one I knew in my family who felt that way. And I just, I guess I just kind of inherited their politics the way I became a Yankees fan, by being, around a bunch of Yankees fans, and that's how I learned how to love baseball.
So that makes that makes you a lonely Maloney.
Yeah, actually, I have another now. I've since learned in the many years since then that I have an aunt who is also closer to my line of thinking than the rest of the Maloneys. But it was very helpful growing up in a family full of liberals, because I actually learned how to talk to liberals without getting them to hate me.
Yeah. You know, Evan, that leads me to my next question. You know, when I transferred from junior college over up to the university, I've been warned about sort of the liberal indoctrination that happens, and I prepared mentally for, you know, various kinds of liberal ideology to be sort of bombarded with. I prepared for a big gay movement at the university. I prepared for a fight against multiculturalism, whether it's pro-black or pro-Hispanic sort of groups and organizations. But what I found is that, you know, those fears did not come true. The most dominating liberal ideology to me was feminism. And it was remarkable to me because I was a history major, and they really went out of their way to incorporate feminism, to take a certain percentage of the class and use feminist books to interpret history when, you know what, it was really something that wasn't appropriate for the class. You know, in your studies, in your research, what did you find as the most dominating liberal ideology that sort of governs in the universities today?
That seems to vary pretty widely by campus, and I think that part of the reason that it varies widely has to do with the particular history of each individual school. A lot of times there are organizations on campus that become essentially departments within the school that form themselves around a different type of left-wing ideology. So, for example, women's studies, I've discovered, is not just the study of women throughout history, but it's intended to get people to adopt a feminist frame of reference in their thinking. And feminism is not the same thing as thinking that women and men are or should be equal. Feminism is a particular form of left-wing ideology that believes that the instruments of government power should be used to coerce people into, say, hiring decisions or affirmative action programs or that type of thing. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that that's what those different studies programs tend to be. But a lot of them came into being directly out of the protest movements in the 60s. So if you had one campus, for example, where you had in the 60s a big group of feminists protesting for a women's studies department, or maybe it was the 70s, depending on the particular issue, that's the kind of thing that led to universities establishing the women's studies program or the various different kinds of studies programs that really aren't about studying anything so much as buying off different constituencies by saying, here, look, here's a building for you. Now, shouldn't this make you happy? Now run along and don't protest us anymore. That's essentially how a lot of those different departments got created. So if you were at a school where the history of the school was such that a women's studies department came into being that way and perhaps not other different departments, then that might account for why your campus had a slightly different culture with respect to that particular issue than others.
You know, my dream is to be a diversity coordinator.
I think, that's the problem. Someone might say, well, hey, wait a minute, a white male, that's not very diverse. But if you're one individual, by definition, you're not diverse anyway, I guess.
I guess so, and it's one of those things. We're looking for that hero somewhere, Evan, that takes a role like that and says, okay, well, let's push true diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of political philosophy. I read a couple weeks ago about a university somewhere who's looking to bring in a conservative.
Yeah, that's University of Colorado.
Yes. And they're looking for someone to come in to be I say token conservative, but they want somebody to come in, to I don't know, a conservative chair or a conservative.
Yeah, it's interesting the way they're implementing it because they're not looking to hire someone who is a conservative necessarily. They're looking to hire someone who is a professor of conservative thinking. And to me, that's a little bit better because if I'm not a fan of affirmative action, I'm kind of going to have a hard time with applying quotas to anything in general. But I do think that it's important for people to be exposed to different lines of thinking. And so if endowing a chair to do that is one of the ways that it could be done. I guess I'm happy that these kind of experiments are happening. I'm not necessarily sure if it's the best possible solution, but at least people are thinking of students and the fact that students need to be getting their money's worth.
It's a confession of sorts.
I guess it is. Yeah. It's interesting because 10 years ago, that never would have happened. People would have said, this is insane, there's no problem at all. At least enough people now recognize that there's a problem, that some people are trying to work on solutions rather than continually convince people of a problem that they don't want to see.
Hey, Evan, as we wrap things up, I want to get your thoughts on the current scene. I want to talk a little politics with you.
Sure.
Obama has taken the nomination as far as we can tell. You've got John McCain representing the Republicans. How do you see things? What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, it's an interesting election because I think a lot of people are going to have trouble getting excited to pull the lever in one way or another because I think as time goes on, it's going to be harder for Barack Obama to maintain the veneer of being a new type of politician. I mean, a convicted felon helped this guy buy his house. He claims to not support any lobbyists or want any lobbyists on his campaign. He just picked a guy who was very cozy with the guy in Countrywide who Barack Obama was criticizing over the mortgage crisis. But I think more importantly than that, although those things cut against the image of Barack Obama being a new type of politician, that and the fact that he got people's signatures knocked off his opponent's ballots because they weren't constructed in the proper way. That's how he actually knocked an opponent off the ballot in Chicago once. So he's a very old school type of Chicago politician. But I think what really hurts him is that there's no way you can spend 20 years in Reverend Wright's church and not know what the guy thinks.
Do you think that sticks? Do you think that Reverend Wright sticks with him throughout the campaign?
Yeah, you know, I think he probably thinks he dodged a bullet, but he forgets that the primary season is very different from the general election. And the types of voters that care about that in the Democratic campaign are different from the voters that are going to care about it in the general election. And I think it's just very hard to say that you're a post-racial candidate when you've been sitting effectively listening to an Al Sharpton clone for 20 years. So then the question becomes, and this is the interesting question because I don't really know the answer, is Barack Obama just a political opportunist who was at that church because that's where his constituents were? It was the largest church in the area, and he was apparently told at the time that if you want to be in Chicago politics, you got to go here. But that doesn't mean you have to have the guy marry you and, you know, confirm your children.
Yeah, well, I heard his wife, Michelle, was a member of that church before they were married. She's the one that brought him to that church.
And that could be. And either way, you're going to have a hard time saying you're a post-racial candidate when you've essentially been listening to Al Sharpton's speeches for 20 years. And so, you know, he either has to say, look, this isn't me. I went there for, you know, pragmatic reasons, but that undercuts his new politician image. Or he has to say, no, I was here because I believe this stuff, in which case he undercuts his post-racial candidate image. So I think he's in a bind, and frankly, I think I don't see how he can survive that Reverend Wright issue. He didn't handle it very well, and I think it's McCain's election to lose. So the question is, how apathetic are people going to be about voting for McCain? And that's what I think McCain's problem is. I don't know very many Republicans who seem terribly excited about voting for him because on a lot of issues he's not that different from a Democrat. You know, I probably think that unless McCain shoots himself in the foot somehow, that he may win the election. You know, I really think that if Obama thinks this Reverend Wright stuff is over, I think he's
what do you
a
think
little
of
bit
McCain?
naive.
What do you think of McCain?
I'm not a huge fan of McCain. I really don't like McCain-Feingold. I think that's a huge slap against the First Amendment. You know, I respect him for his views on the surge. I think he was very brave in supporting the surge and supporting the war when everybody thought it was a lost cause. And now that we're on the brink of victory, it looks like, I think that's going to very much work in McCain's favor. But, I'm personally not a huge fan of his immigration policy. I'm not a huge fan of his environmental policy. I personally like him on taxes. I like him to a certain degree on foreign policy. I'm not entirely supportive on all his views on that. So me personally, I will probably vote for him, but I won't be very enthusiastic about doing it. And there is a chance that he could lose my vote depending on what he does between now and the election.
Evan, last couple minutes here. I just want to ask you about your film, Indoctrinate U. I want to ask you about the distribution aspects of it. I know you've been having trouble trying to find somebody in Hollywood that would sponsor it. We know that, movies that are full of lies like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and Michael Moore's films that are a bunch of BS half the time, they get a lot of, sort of notice in Hollywood when they get picked up. What's going on, with Indoctrinate U? Are you still trying to get a big production company to pick it up? And where can our audience access the film at?
Well, right now the film is available on indoctrinateu.com. It can be downloaded or you can order DVDs. We've had screenings in a number of theaters around the country. We had a big, huge screening at the Kennedy Center in D.C. We had one at the Directors Guild of America Theater here in New York. And we're actually about to have our L.A. premiere this Sunday at 8 p.m. Sunday night the 15th. At the Bovard Auditorium at USC. We're going to be screening it out there. It's free for USC students or $10 otherwise. And, if you had asked me that question 6 months ago, I probably would have been a lot more pessimistic than I am now, and a lot more hopeful that a big distributor would pick it up. But as I see the numbers come in on our sales, and seeing the reaction that we're getting from people, I'm beginning to think that it's a blessing in disguise that Hollywood was so short-sighted that they couldn't possibly think that there was an audience for a different type of documentary. And so, we're going to be a profitable film. And to be honest, if we had sold our film to a distributor, the likelihood of us seeing any proceeds from that are pretty low. We probably would have about broken even, but the dirty little secret of the film business is if you're an independent filmmaker and you sell your film to a distributor 9 times out of 10, or probably 99 times out of 100, you're not going to make a dime off that. So, you know what? Hollywood didn't believe in us, and we're going to prove them wrong, and we're going to be laughing all the way to the bank.
Hey, Evan, Evan, are we going to see a part 2?
I don't know about this film. The problem with academia is that there's so much material. I could make this a lifetime obligation covering academia. There are a lot of different ideas I'd like to work on, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out of the realm of possibility that I would cover this topic again in the future. It's just too important to ignore.
Hey, real quick, where can conservatives go to get a good education? Have you thought about colleges that offer conservatives a well-rounded education?
Well, I know that there are schools out there like Hillsdale that a lot of people love, and I honestly couldn't tell you much about other than knowing about it and knowing what its reputation is. It sounds very good. But my experience personally, I can only tell you from my own, is that I thought that as someone who came into college thinking of himself as somewhat right of center, that going into college with that perspective, especially a college that had a pretty liberal environment, I thought that ultimately after 4 years that benefited me. I think I came out a better understander of what I believed than I would have if I went to a place where everybody already thought like me. It is harder for conservatives who want to be exposed to different ideas because a lot of times they're going to have to take it upon themselves to do research and to find people like John Stuart Mill or to find people like Milton Friedman or Ludwig von Mises. These are people who people aren't going to be able to find a lot of times because they're not necessarily in the reading material. But I think there's a certain utility in being in an environment with a lot of people who disagree with you. So, I wouldn't necessarily warn people away from, the more standard more left-leaning campuses.
No, I agree with you, too. And the conservatives that I've met and that I like to talk to are thinkers. I always said the conservative is the thinking man, the thinking person. It's a philosophy that takes that. And much of the reason for that is that you've got to go out and find your information. You've got to get out and read on your own. And I found in my classes that I was studying twice. I was studying what the professor gave me, and then I was trying to find the other point of view. And I think one of my greatest strengths, and in the debates that we're going to have in the following weeks here on this show as we go along to November, is that I know both sides of the argument. I go out of my way to know both sides of it. And I think that's why it's important. What you show in Indoctrinate U is important because there's some recognition by a lot of people that there's a bias on the campuses, but that it's hopeless, and that there's a sense that it's overwhelming. And some of the tenacity and sass that you see in some of the students that you interview, you know what? That in itself gives some hope.
It is possible to get through 4 years of an indoctrination mill and come out better on the other end, believe it or not. You just have to be very sure of who you are, and you have to do a little bit of extra work, probably a lot of extra work in some cases, but there are worse things in life than doing a little extra work.
Evan Coyne Maloney, creator, Indoctrinate U. He's, like I said, a conservative warrior. We do appreciate you coming on tonight and talking to us about your inspiration, about the difference that you're making. We appreciate you, Evan.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Thanks a lot, Evan.
Take care. Have a good night.
You too. You know what, Frank, that's what gives you hope. This guy goes out of his way to do that, goes out of his way recognizing he's going to go in there into the lion's den, makes a show out of it, and allows us to see in the comfort of our college. And while it may cement a lot of our preconceptions about what's happening on the campuses, it's good to see someone bringing that out into the open. And I think in the long run, he actually changes things. I think he actually makes a difference in the long run.
I agree with that because he's exposing those, professors that, are have their own sort of political agenda. Look, this is something, me and you have talked about this a lot. This issue has been something that's I've been very sympathetic toward it because of what I faced in college, Shane, the discrimination that I faced. And, I'll never forget some of the grades that I got lowered because of, because of my political opinion. I remember a couple times calling you on the phone ready to cry because my papers had been, it really was amazing. You guys, I put weeks of effort into these papers, and these teachers like, no, sorry, no good.
I had the same thing. I wrote a huge paper on Machiavelli, The Prince, which I had already read 3 times, but I had taken an honors political science class, and I'd written this paper, and the professor gave it back to me a week later with a B, and I was shocked. I was like, wow. I mean, I worked for like 6 weeks on it. It was beautiful. The people that I had proofreaded around me in the aisles were just shaking their head and throwing it back at me and grabbing theirs and just walking out the door, And I asked, and I was reading, and he hadn't read Betty. He had written a bunch of stuff on it. And at the end of the class, I walked up to him and I said, what happened? A B, and he goes, well, I'm not really sure that you wrote that. And I said, I wrote it. I spent weeks on this thing. This is me. And he's like, oh, really? And he said a few things, and he goes, well, let me take it back. And he took it back, and he gave me an A-.
Oh, geez.
It was just like he didn't understand because in my paper I had written while Machiavelli was considered a bad person, what he was generally doing was taking political science to not an immoral level, but a level above consequence.
Yeah,
and that's what he was doing. It had to be seen in that way, and he just didn't understand. He didn't like it or whatever it was. But it was one of the many examples where I had people that just looked at me and just shook their heads. And so, hey, you know what? Conservatives got to work twice as hard, man. Right where there you go.
Yeah, I could tell you tons of those stories as well. I'll tell you real quick, specifically with me, I had an English teacher who was completely leftist socialist, and, that's when I was I considered myself more of a libertarian at the time. She had studied a lot of economic issues, taxes, and the role of government. And, I really handed her ass to her in class. And, I learned the hard way that you don't do that to teachers. You got to be a little bit more kind, a little bit more coy. I tend to be a bomb thrower, and that teacher never forgave me the whole semester. She never once called on me again. She never once looked me in the eyes or the face. I'm not lying to you. She was so angry at me for the whole semester. Beautiful papers that I wrote. It should have been an A class. She gave me a C as a final grade. I'll never forget that as long as I live.
Yeah, well, that's what you get, Frank. You're one of those Italians, loud Italians. Yeah. Who killed Jesus, by the way, as Reverend Knight said.
That's right, the Italians.
So you deserve a C for that. Okay, we're going to go on a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about political vindication. We're going to talk a little bit about this report from the Senate Committee on Intelligence. I think that's an oxymoron. We're going to talk a little bit about Obama, too, who's decided he doesn't know whether he's going to take public funds now. He promised he would. Now he says he won't. Well, hey, he got $100 million in the bank. Why not?
When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school.
Call in to BB Radio, 646-652-4598.